All right, so everything's set up now. Like I said, let me know if there's any instability in the connection. Please don't hesitate. Um, and I want to resume this week the lecture series that we are in the middle of. And I do want to wrap it up pretty quickly because, in a sense, the jumping off point, the focus was what's the discussion we're supposed to be having as we approach the 2022 elections. And guess what? We're no longer approaching the 2022 elections. They're in the rearview mirror. And so I do want to talk a little bit about what we've learned in the 10 days since the election occurred, a little bit more data, a little bit more of a sense of perhaps what determined the election results. But then I want to return where we left off. And we were talking about this idea of a new Cold War and the question of whether or not the reemergence of great power rivalry in a context of global interdependence and global catastrophic risk is going to prevent us from doing what we need to do in order to manage that risk. And so that's where I'll return. Before I get there, let me just spend a few minutes on looking in a little bit more detail at what we now know about the outcome of the election. And of course, we now know for sure that the Democrats have controlled 50 seats and so have retained control of the Senate. There'll be a special runoff election in Georgia between Warnock and Walker. And I'm not in the business of gaming or predicting, but my sense is that there's a pretty good likelihood that Warnock will hold on to his Senate seat and that the result will be that the Democrats will have 51. But in a sense, that's just a cushion. And it's not much of a cushion. So it probably doesn't make much difference, especially in light of the fact that the Republicans have gained control of the House of Representatives. They have now flipped the 6 additional seats they had not gained last time we were together. And the result is, of course, that we'll have divided government going into the next 2 years. And that means, on the one hand, that the legislative agenda of the Democrats probably comes to a halt. And on the other hand, that the Republicans are limited in what they can do because they don't control both chambers of Congress, because the House has investigative powers, subpoena power. We can expect, I think, among other things, Republican investigations of the Biden administration. And I think one of the big questions will be, how aggressive are they in investigating Biden? Do they attempt to not only investigate the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which probably needs investigation, but also Hunter Biden, which I think, to just preview for a second, their core base has real appetite for, right? That this is their effort to expose what they see as endemic and rampant corruption from the Democratic Party, going all the way up to Joe Biden. But I think the American people would be quite repulsed by. And when I say the American people, I guess I mean the 2/3 of us who aren't part of the Republican base. And so how much will Speaker McCarthy be able to keep his troops in line and not engage in fishing expeditions that are ultimately going to be unpopular? The very narrow majority that the Republicans have in the House means that the far right of the party will be empowered, be able to withhold their consent if McCarthy and the leadership don't do some of their bidding, right? And so I imagine all of this is familiar. I'm just trying to bring you up to date. Let me now again try to put in perspective what just happened. And I think there are two things to see here. And so last week I tried to differentiate voting behavior from public opinion formation, right? And that the outcome of a vote does not necessarily give you all of the information you need to know where the public's ideas are moving or the various constituencies that together constitute the public. And I guess I want to further differentiate this week between voting behavior and voting outcomes. And so let's start with voting outcomes and putting this in historical perspective, right? That Biden in 2022 lost less than 1/5 of the seats that Obama in 2010 or Clinton in 1994 lost, did even better than Reagan in 82 or Bush in 90. And so in this sense, this is not the red wave that many people expected, and especially given what's going on in the economy, given that the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency, given that Biden is quite unpopular, this is a surprising outcome, one that defies the gravity of the fundamentals, which were pulling the country in the direction of the Republicans. So that's the outcome. What about voting behavior? And here I want to suggest that actually the country did move generally in the Republican direction during this election, just not as much as anticipated. And so this graph displays all of the congressional districts, or almost all of the congressional districts. And you can see here, right, this is the line that separates the districts where Democrats won from the districts that Republicans won. And the thing you see here, right, is that in the districts that the Republicans won, obviously things shifted in a Republican direction, but even in the districts that the Democrats won, there are more red arrows than blue arrows, more movement in the direction of the Republicans than the Democrats. But that movement wasn't strong enough to constitute a red wave. Why not? And here I think this data is very helpful, which is if you differentiate Republicans who were strongly identified with Donald Trump, with his core issues, especially with denying that the 2020 election was correctly decided, you see that those Republicans got a very little marginal increase in overall electoral support. Whereas Republicans who were independent from Donald Trump or did not repeat his core claims about the 2020 election did much better, right? And so in many ways, the very small red movement we see in 2022 probably represents a MAGA drag, a Make American Great Again drag. And I want to be as clear as possible. If you're looking in at these results and trying to read the tea leaves and say, well, how badly did the Republicans do? How well did the Democrats do? That it's probably much more that the Republicans have a self-inflicted wound, or a wound inflicted by Donald Trump, that had he stayed out of this election, had he not handpicked a whole bunch of candidates or demanded that candidates repeat his core talking points, or had those candidates not seen it as essential to be strongly identified with Donald Trump in order to secure the nomination of their party or to be viable in the general election, that the Republicans might have done better in this election. And that has implications for 2024, right? And the big question here is whether Donald Trump will be on the ballot or not. And I think in a sense, the scenario in which Donald Trump or one of the politicians that very much looks and feels like him, we'll have to see if Ron DeSantis is that person or not, isn't on the ballot. The Republicans don't have this drag. And then perhaps the Democrats should not be too satisfied with what happened in 2022, at least in terms of predicting what might happen in 2024. One more thing to say about this, although from a partisan perspective, this is not so much a victory for the Democrats, from a broader perspective, assuming, like me, you don't think that Donald Trump is healthy for American democracy. You don't think that a politician that refuses to accept the results of elections they've lost is good for democracy. A politician who demands or encourages officials who will only register the results of elections accurately if they're won by their party, who has been impeached a couple times, who's under multiple simultaneous investigations, possibly leading to criminal charges. I'm not going to talk about the appointment of the special counsel today, yeah, if I can avoid it. So that kind of person who also has authoritarian and right wing, populist, nationalist, ethno racial aspects to the way that they conduct themselves politically, that kind of person is not good for democracy, then the fact that the electorate punished the officials closely associated with him is a good sign for democracy, but just not for the Democratic Party per se. Looking at this in a little bit more detail, right? This is the national map. And I think we should be paying close attention to Florida and Ohio and noting that states that were already voting pretty dominantly Republican became even more Republican in 2022. And so this is Florida, for instance. And as you can see, every congressional district in Florida, including those that had voted for Biden in 2020, became more conservative, voted more for Republican candidates in 2022. And I think part of what this means is really that Florida and Ohio are no longer swing states in the way that they have been for much of the 21st century, right? With the outcome of the 2000 election turning on how Florida went, et cetera. And that the consequence is that, in a sense, the fight for the parties, the states that will determine the presidential election of 2024 shift into the Great Lake states, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, into a couple southern states, Georgia and North Carolina, and into a couple western states, Arizona and Nevada. Those are the states, and here I'm showing Michigan to illustrate this, that had simultaneous movement in both directions, right? So in some red districts, in fact, the Republicans did better. In some blue districts, the Democrats did better. There are exceptions in both of these regards, but these are states where voters appear a little bit more swingy, if you will, a little bit more likely to change their mind election from election, and in which the electorate of the state is a little bit less homogenous. Some people who are moving to the right, some people who are moving to the left, some people who are willing to split their tickets as well. And so I think that's another thing to notice as we get a little bit more fine-grained information about what happened 10 days ago in the elections. Next thing to notice, redistricting mattered, but not nearly as much as in 2022 as it did in 2012. I've shared with you data diagrams before that show that for the decade of the 2010s, on average, the Republicans had about 30 more seats in Congress than they would have had if there had been nonpartisan districting. And the Democrats had some gerrymandering too, but because of this 2009 Lee Atwater Red Map initiative, in which the Republicans targeted gaining complete control over states in 2010, so as to be completely in control of redistricting in the aftermath of the 2010 census, the Republicans drew the districts of many states to strongly favor them. And even when they lost control of that state, complete control of that state, it was too late for the Democrats to redraw those districts unless courts found them to be problematically gerrymandered, which is less and less likely, especially in federal courts. So 2020, there's another census. 2021, more redistricting. 2022, the new elections reflect the new districts, and it did tilt the outcome in some elections, right? And there are probably a handful of new Republicans elected to Congress because of the way in which districts were redrawn, at least a handful, right? And several of them come from New York. And in New York, it's interesting because obviously the Democrats are in control of New York, but they got greedy, would be one way to put it. They got punished, would be another way to put it, which is to say that their district map got challenged in court. The court found against the Democrats, and the court imposed its own districts, and those districts turn out to be a fair bit less favorable to the Democrats. But having said that, in a state like New York, it is probably the case, and I'll go back to the previous diagram for a moment. Let me go back 2 diagrams, that the rightward shift of the electorate was more important than the districting. But in some of these other states, in Virginia, for instance, the redistricting almost certainly helped the Republican candidates to win. This diagram shows you the old district as opposed to the new district, and the way in which the district has shifted and how that shifts the partisan composition of the electorate. One more thing to note here, and we talked about this a little bit last week. At the state level, and I've done a little bit more research to put this in historical perspective, and one way to describe this is that this is the first election since 1935 where the incumbent president's party won control of 4 new state legislatures. So you have to go all the way back to the New Deal revolution, FDR, to find a similar shift in favor of the incumbent president. And as we see, right, the Democrats picked up 2 governorships, the GOP lost 2, the Democrats picked up 4 legislatures, the Republicans picked up none. I emphasize that this is important for both stopping gerrymandering and other aspects of partisan manipulation of the electoral process, and also important if there's going to be meaningful climate change legislation over the next couple of years. It will almost certainly have to be at the state level. So the states of Massachusetts, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, where the Democrats now have complete control of state government, in a sense, that's where the climate change action shifts to. Bob, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Two points. Number one, you say, okay, a lot more people are voting for Republicans, or things are moving in the Republican direction, but that conflicts with the truth that 4 governorships went Democratic and other things that were going on the states level. So I'm not sure how to reconcile those 2. And then secondly, to your point last week about calcification, I'm sure you saw Ezra Klein's comment on that in one of his most recent things, and which was absolutely striking. That it used to be that people were only 50%. I've forgotten exactly how he put it, but the calcification has gone from 50% to 90% over the last 50 years or so.
Yes. So let me speak to the first point to offer a clarification. And so the data on the electorate moving to the right is based on congressional districts at a national level. right? And I think that's different from, for instance, votes for governorships or control of state legislatures. And part of what I emphasized last week is that there was more ticket splitting in 2022 than there has been of late. And so that reflects, in fact, a slight move away from the calcification of the electorate. But the other thing I emphasized last week, and I don't think I've got the diagram here to reiterate, but that in states where abortion access was potentially in jeopardy, if Republicans gained control, and then you'd have to specify, but especially at the state level, those states tended not to move Republican, and the voters tended to bring abortion higher on the list of things that they were most concerned about. In a couple of those states, at least, abortion became more important than inflation. In several of the other ones, abortion became as or almost as important as inflation, right? And so there are states that defy the national trend. And I do think one of the things that's really important to notice about this election, typically a midterm election is a referendum on the president's party. And that is because the most important things that have happened in the previous 2 years have been initiated by the president. In 2022, the most important thing that had happened in the previous 2 years is the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, at least as far as a substantial portion of the electorate was concerned. And so, in a sense, Joe Biden was relieved from having a referendum conducted on him. And that was particularly the case in those states where voters were really focused on abortion because abortion access was at risk. So I hope that helps to make a little bit more sense of those outcomes. In
Yes, it
terms
does.
of calcification, I am certainly familiar with, and the research here is by Lynn Vavreck, who actually was a colleague of mine for a few years at Dartmouth, and then John Sides, they're both at UCLA, and a third colleague. And it's, I think, very good, very impressive, very interesting research. I just think that it's also the case that voters are people, and people can and do change their minds as circumstances change. And so I think there's no doubt that the period of 2016 to 2020, when Donald Trump dominates the Republican Party and pushes the Republican Party in a ethno-racial nationalist direction, shows general disregard for the rule of law, a highly instrumental approach to politics, including even foreign policy, trying to get the leader of the Ukraine to dish dirt against Joe Biden's son, that's a period in which people really do dig in, and that there's a clarification. If you want a more diverse, more liberal, more redistributive government that's more active party, you know which party you're voting for, right? If you want the other side, right? If you want an ethno-nationalist party that's going to cut your taxes and limit the regulatory power of the state, going to get out of international treaties on climate change, et cetera, you know which party you're for. There's no ambiguity, and people are really pretty well sorted. It's hard to be indecisive, hard to be uncommitted when the differences between the two parties are so sharp. One of the questions I think is worth thinking through is whether, without Trump on the ballot, there's a little bit more latitude, a little bit of a movement away from calcification in 2022 than there was in 2020 or 2016, which is the period that Vavrick and Sykes research is based in. They'll do more research, and we'll get to see what they make out of it. Anybody else with a question at this point? I'm basically done talking about 2022 at this point. I think Bob, are you still there? Maybe Bob had a jewelry emergency, but we'll push on, and I hope I did a decent job answering Bob's questions. So yes, I am basically done with what I wanted to say, and so now in terms of 2022, and if there are any questions, you'll let me know. But if not, let me get back then into the topic that we left off on a couple weeks ago. Is there a new Cold War emerging in world politics? A new set of rivalries in which countries increasingly find it advantageous or necessary to align in loose blocks. I don't want to suggest this is the old Cold War in which there was a really clear division into two blocks with formal alliances, but at least informal blocks, and that the fundamental axis, the dividing line here, is between democracies and autocracies, countries that have relatively free, fair, open elections, that have open media systems that protect civil rights, and countries that tend to be ruled by more authoritarian leaders, by perhaps a single party or a single ruler, and that are hostile in many ways to liberal rights. It's funny because Viktor Orban of Hungary calls himself an illiberal Democrat, and so I would put him in the autocratic camp as well. We discussed Russia in this context a fair bit as a kind of exemplary personal or personalistic autocracy, right? Where really one leader holds almost all of the power. And as that leader decides, so goes the country, right? And that in many ways, Russia is suffering right now for the way in which Putin has personally consolidated power over most of the institutions of his society, not only the state, but also the media and key economic institutions as well. So there's very little independent power basis with which to resist Vladimir Putin's will. And so if he wants to invade the Ukraine, he's going to invade the Ukraine, and there's not much Russians can do to change that outcome. And I focused on Russia not only as exemplary of the movement in the direction of autocracy, and perhaps especially personalistic autocracy, but also because the way in which the invasion of the Ukraine is challenging the idea of international order. And to the extent that there's been an international order that has been in place for the last 30 years, it's an order that the United States has been both the architect and the anchor of, right? We've played a leading role in creating its norms and institutions and in enforcing its rules. And that order has clearly a single regulative principle. It has many other principles, but the most important keystone of the international order is the idea of the territorial integrity of sovereign states, that neighbors don't take bites out of neighbors just because they're more powerful and they want their neighbors' resources, or they think it's going to be good theater to distract from domestic discontent. And Putin just flat out violated that norm and did so in the most egregious way, right? You know, you could argue what he did in Georgia, in Crimea, in the previous decade was more of the same, but that this is, I think, a new level, and it poses a new challenge to the post-Cold War global order, such as it is or it was. And so looking at Putin as having damaged that order, and having done that with you, I now want to continue talking about the rise of autocracy in general, the alternative model of autocracy we see in Xi Jinping's China, and more generally, the idea of the new dynamics of international relations in the coming decade, and how challenging this is going to be for the United States or for anyone who believes that global cooperation is imperative. And so that'll be the dominant focus of today. And then I will try to talk a little bit more going forward about what we might learn for the coming decade from the previous 2 decades, what we might learn from the fact of the rather disastrous conclusion of our 2 decade long intervention in Afghanistan, and more generally, the war on terror, and then what we need to do to manage the growing risk of global catastrophe, right? That the conference of the participants and the UN framework for managing climate change is trying to wrap up right now in Egypt. And whether or not there will be a successful resolution to this conference, an ability to continue to extend and in fact, invigorate the framework that we're using to try to manage global climate change, the most urgent catastrophic risk the planet and humanity faces today, is very much in doubt. And by the way, it's the United States and China that I think of as the main impediments to action. We'll get into this, but clearly we have urgent problems to solve. We're not doing a very good job, and the world is getting more and more complicated, more adverse to cooperation and concerted effort, despite the fact that that is absolutely and urgently what we need in this decade. And then finally, some thoughts about how to rework our, not the details of our foreign policy, but our general stance to the foreign policy. So this is where we concluded 2 weeks ago, talking about how much more complicated the world is as we re-enter a multipolar world, a world in which there's not one main power, us, or two main powers, the Soviet Union and its bloc, and the United States and NATO and our bloc, but multiple regional powers, each with a great deal of latitude to act in the way that they want to act within their own regions, and how hard it has been for the American foreign policy and military establishments to change their orientation, to pivot into this more complicated world. I suggested a little bit 2 weeks ago, I'll say a little bit more as we get further into this, that part of the reason we fell into the trap of the war on terror, and I'll preview what I want to say about this, that I think it was a mistake to make this the guiding framework for American foreign policy for 20 years, is because it allowed us to continue to view the world in a bipolar way. There's us and there's jihadi terrorists, and now there's a nice, right, rivalry between two dominant blocs. Turns out the problem is that jihadi terrorism was not really a dominant bloc, not really a rival, not certainly the rival we should have been paying more attention to, which is probably autocracy, probably led by China and also supported by, and then we'd have a whole list of countries, including Russia, the Saudis, Iran. Now we could add Hungary and Turkey, etc. And so we failed to see the emerging order or the emerging dynamics of foreign relations, in part because we demanded that a framework that had developed for a different world be used to understand the emerging world. We have to be more nimble, more objective or impartial as we understand the context in which we operate in the 2020s if we're going to have any chance of success. I suggested, in addition to that, right, one of the hallmarks of the democratic societies of the world is that we have open communication and media systems. We believe in freedom of speech, freedom of press, and these systems are being disrupted by new technology, digital communication technology, social media technology, and that technology makes our public spheres more porous to both disinformation, which can be domestically or internationally generated, and in particular to efforts to influence our public opinion that come from our rivals, but that are disguised, transmitted via the tools of communication, which more and more of us use, but which allow for this kind of manipulation. And so that makes this still more complicated. One more complicating factor is that we live in a world of global economic interdependence. And so whether we're talking about our phones or our cars, our computers, our televisions, our microwaves, our washers and dryers, our blenders. But let me add, and there's a wonderful book by Sasha Eisenberg on this, where he traces the supply lines necessary to make the plate of sushi that he eats at a Japanese restaurant in New York City. And he finds basically that there's supplies that come from 40 countries that go into everything involved in making that meal, right? And so even our plate of what appears to be relatively simple food, uncooked fish, is deeply dependent on economic interdependence, and that interdependence can be weaponized, as we see in the case of Russia going both ways, right? The US and its allies trying to pressure Russia by sanctioning its economy, Russia funding its war, and in the war itself, increasing gas prices, oil prices, and so continuing to get revenue even after countries are trying to avoid purchasing its oil. This is the new emerging world. It's one that's going to be much more complicated. The argument I'm making in part is that the new emerging axis is between societies that loosely or roughly want to think of themselves as democracies and that do in fact decide who will rule, what regime will be in place based on the outcome of regularly conducted elections that are, generally speaking, open, that there's party competition and those parties don't try to consolidate all power and put the leader or the other party in jail, etc. Right? That's one block. The other block is autocracies, right? Societies that are ruled by single individuals, single parties, groups that consolidate power and try to prevent fair, open competition from determining who will continue to rule the society. And as this diagram shows, one of the features of the last 15 years in world politics has been the ascendancy of autocracy, that the number of countries that are healthy democracies is shrinking, the number of countries that are organized autocratically is growing. And this is, I think, explained in two ways. And these diagrams, I hope, will be familiar, but I'm now using them in an international as opposed to a domestic context. There's a story I like to tell about traveling in Morocco in 1989, I think it was, and being in the souk and the old city without electricity, without plumbing, without automobile access because the roads are too narrow in Marrakesh, and hearing Like a Virgin by Madonna piping out of one of the windows I'm walking past and thinking to myself, is there anywhere in the world where you wouldn't hear that song? But what does that song represent, right? This is an openly empowered and sexual woman singing about her sexuality, advertising the fact that she's not a virgin, but that the current sex she's having is making her feel that way, right? And so one way to express this then is that this is a kind of culture that is being exported to the non-Western world by the Western world, that is commercial, that is making money for those who make and produce it, distribute it as well, that has a certain content to it that I think you could describe as post or anti-traditional, and that certain people in the world that this culture is being exported to find this new Western commercial culture in movies, in music, increasingly in digital communication and video games to be enticing, intriguing, and perhaps liberating, but that there are many other people who find this culture to be shocking and to be threatening. And just as in the West, right, the increasing fluidity of gender identity, for instance, is very threatening to some people, and they're looking for ways to stop it from taking over, so too in many other places in the world. This influx of cultural exports is experienced as a normative threat, and this leads societies to turn to, or at least portions of society, to turn to authoritarian leaders who promise to stop the influx and the transformation that it's bringing about, the threat to tradition, to religion, to gender, to sexuality. And so one source of the ascendancy of autocracy over the last 10 to 15 years is cultural. Another source I want to suggest is well understood by looking at these diagrams. And so if one of the main principles of the post-Cold War global order has been democracy promotion and the promotion of international institutions that are supposed to be governed on the basis of principles of international justice. One thing to notice is who these international institutions benefit and who they don't, right? And as you can see, right, in this diagram that I'm pointing to, the kind of soccer ball, that the United States has 4%, a little bit more than 4% of the world's population, and 30% of the world's wealth, right? China, about 20% of the world's population and less than 20% of the world's wealth. But when we get down here, right, to the some of the most populous places in the world, Africa and other countries, one of the things we notice immediately, right, is tiny little portions of the world's wealth, right? 1%, 2%, 3%, with large portions of humanity essentially shut out of global wealth creation. And I'm not going to go into it today, but there's pretty good evidence that a fair bit of the wealth that has enriched the United States, North America, Europe, is actually extracted from other parts of the world. And so the rich are getting richer at the expense of the poor. That's, as far as many people in the world are concerned, the new world order. I mentioned that there's a conference occurring in Egypt about global climate change and that it stalled. It was supposed to have ended yesterday. I haven't updated my news feeds, but as far as I know, it's still going on, but that they are deadlocked. And part of the reason they're deadlocked is because the United States and China are resisting a initiative that is supported by much of the less developed world, but also by the European Union for this conference and the framework that it works under to involve firm commitments to fund the damages and loss suffered by less developed countries as climate change takes hold and really begins to cause extreme weather, drought, famine, flooding, and also to render certain portions of the less developed world less and less inhabitable. These are countries that have fewer resources to mitigate these damages, to manage the risks. And as we see in this diagram, right, again, the United States, 4% of the world's population, responsible, I would say for, well, let's look at it, 24, 25% of the greenhouse gases in the world's stratosphere right now, right? And note the very close correspondence between the amount of wealth and the amount of contribution to climate change in the United States. Again, Europe in total responsible for nearly 20%, China responsible for around 14%, and then large swaths of the world with large amounts of population, basically very little responsibility for the amount of heat trapping gas in the world's atmosphere. And yet those countries are the ones that are going to bear the highest human and economic costs. We see this in Pakistan, for instance. Pakistan has emitted greenhouse gases over its entire history that are equivalent to what the United States emits every year, right? Just on an annual basis. And yet it's Pakistan that is having these terrible monsoon floods that are disrupting its food supply, making millions of people homeless, putting vast regions underwater. And right, the idea that somehow we have a global international order rooted not just in the power of the more powerful societies, but in the principles of global or international justice is hard to sustain once we see these findings. And my suggestion then is that when we look at the outcome of the vote at the United Nations on condemning the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and notice that the majority of the world's population is governed by societies that either abstained or chose to absent themselves or actually voted against the resolution, right? And that it's 42% of the world's population that's governed by countries that voted for the resolution condemning Russia for invading Ukraine. So almost 60% on the other side in one way or another. That shouldn't surprise us so much, right? Because the was as outraged as we should be by what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, this resolution, I think, is not only about condemning the brutality, the barbarism, the inhumanity of the Russian invasion, but it's also a referendum on the order that generates the norms that condemn that invasion. And that order, as far as most people in the world are concerned, is not such a great order. It's an order constructed by the winners of the Cold War that was to their benefit, but not to the benefit of the rest of the world. And so, right, that is the second reason for the rise of autocracy, the effort to make democracy a principle of international relations, a standard of legitimacy enshrined in international institutions, appears suspect at best, hypocritical at worst. And by the way, then we add that a large number of the democracies of the world are suffering backsliding, are eroding their democratic institutions. The United States is a key example of this. Obviously, the January 6th invasion, but also the way in which the Supreme Court is becoming increasingly illiberal, the effort to gerrymander and to make access to the ballot more difficult. All of this suggests that democracy is not, in fact, very healthy in the democratic world at the same time that the autocratic world is gaining power, gaining strength. Finally, for today, I want to turn to China, and I turn to China as the leader and the most important exemplar of autocracy in the world today, but also as clearly the emerging rival to the United States in terms of its economic and military might, and also in terms of its assertiveness in foreign relations. The world we're facing as we enter the middle of the 21st century will be a world in which China will not be nearly as restive, as inwardly focused as it has been for the last 30 years, as it's built or rebuilt its economic system and increasingly its economic might. It has primarily directed its energies inward. That project has basically succeeded, and it seems clear that the Chinese are pivoting to an outward focus. So let's start with the basis for China's growing power. I know it's the sixth point in my outline, but I want to just notice, and this diagram is a little tricky. It has a logarithmic or an inverted logarithmic scale. Sorry, what that means is right that this little portion of the diagram covers 1,000 years. The next portion covers another 1,000 years, right? So a lot of history concentrated in the first half inch of this diagram. And frankly, the action really begins around here, right? Which is the 1850s, the beginning of the period of industrialization. And so what you can see is for 1,800 of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies on the planet have been the two most populous economies on the planet in the areas that we now refer to as China and India. But that beginning with industrialization, beginning with the use of fossil fuel and the rapid transformation of technology that enabled the vast increase in productivity, a country that isn't even on the map for most of this period, the United States emerges as the largest economy in the world. And China, especially during the period of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, has its economy fundamentally disorganized by the Communist Party, and it shrinks to a tiny little portion of what it was. India, as a result of British colonialism and then the post-revolutionary period, sees its economy, I should say the post-independence period, sees its economy shrink, but India's doing a little bit better now, China much better, right? And please note, the United States economic might is shrinking as a proportion of global GDP or global productivity, not because the US economy is shrinking, but because places like Japan, India, China are growing, right? And so the Chinese are going to overtake the United States, at least in macro terms, if not in per capita terms, as again having the largest economy in the world in the middle of the 20th century. And that coincides with the really important political change happening in China. And that is that premier, president, chair of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, is increasingly consolidating personalistic autocratic power in China. And so you will have noticed that a little bit more than a month ago, China had its 20th Communist Party Congress. And one of the outcomes of that Congress is that Chairman Xi is now going to have a third term heading the party and the state. And that involved actually having to change the constitution of both the party and the state, which in the post-Mao era only allowed for 2 consecutive terms as premier or chair. Now there is no term limit. And one of the things we know about how personalistic autocracy tends to end, in 90 to 95% of the cases where there's a personalistic autocrat in charge of a state, their rule ends when they die, right? And so Chairman Xi is in his 70s. How, right, much longer will he rule? How much longer will he live? Those questions may have the same answer. And so the fact that he has consolidated power, that everyone on the Politburo and the executive committee to the Politburo is there because she put them there, is a right indication that as she goes, so goes China. And by the way, the consolidation of power coincides. If you look at Chairman Xi's address, and it's printed and translated in terms of what he said to the 20th Party Congress, this was a move away from the idea that China would have continued economic growth and that China would essentially stay on the sidelines of world affairs. As opposed to that, there was a lot of rhetoric to do with rough weather coming in the domestic economy, and I'll share some data with you on that next week, but also that China would be increasingly engaged in international affairs, that its posture would be nationalistic, militaristic, and expansionistic. And what we saw with Putin, right, the idea that basically when you have a successful autocratic consolidation of power, then the autocrat just makes their decisions, and those become the decisions of the state and society, obviously not as catastrophic from a humanitarian point of view, but nevertheless, China's zero COVID policy, right? This policy that basically says, rather than letting people interact despite the fact that we have a pandemic, what we're going to do is close down those portions of society wherever COVID is transmitted quickly, right? So lockdowns of apartment buildings, villages, even factories, surrounding apartment buildings with chain link fences and troops and cameras and even drones to monitor where the people are going to make sure nobody leaves, right? This COVID policy is not working. It's economically disruptive. And in terms of epidemiological ideas, the World Health Organization has been very clear, this is not a successful policy. But given that Chairman Xi has embraced this policy and that nobody seems capable of opposing him or changing his mind, this is China's policy now nearly 3 years into the pandemic, despite the fact that it is clearly not working. And so I hope you can see the parallels there between what's happening in China and what's happening in Russia. Why don't I stop there for today? I imagine you have questions and things you want to discuss, and I want to leave a few minutes for that as well. Who wants to start us out? Who is that? Somebody Okay, Flossie, go ahead. And I think you're unmuted, so go right ahead.
Trivia. I'm thinking about the Republicans in New York. Which section is it? Is it along the Hudson River, where you have already rather rich Republicans staked out? Is that where the vote has changed or increased?
Yes. Yeah,
the rich are becoming richer there, but they're also removing themselves from Trump. They're not removing themselves from Kevin McCarthy because he will give them the taxes that they want. Is that a possible explanation?
So Flossie, let me try to speak to this. And I think you know that around 4 years ago, I moved from Manhattan to Westchester. And
Yes, yes.
there's a famous advertisement in Manhattan where it's for a storage company, and it says you could move to the burbs and then you'd have room in your closet for your clothes, but then you might have to put your sexuality in the closet, right? And
Yes.
the idea,
Yes.
yeah, the idea being basically that, you know, living in Manhattan, especially the Upper West Side where I lived, it was about as liberal as it got, right? And you know, it is actually the case that there are more registered independents than registered Republicans in Manhattan. Coming to Westchester, I've encountered a fair bit more Republicans, and some of them are neighbors. Some of them are people who, for various reasons, I come into some sustained social contact with, and some of them were Trump supporters. I actually haven't had many conversations with them of late, but what they said was very clear. No, I don't like his politics. By the way, some of these people are racial minorities, right? I don't like his politics with regards to race, or his governing style, or his penchant for lying, right? I was just reviewing this the other day. Trump told on average publicly 6 lies a day when he was president. But I got what I wanted by voting for him, which is I got tax cuts. Right. So there is that perspective. But having said that, if I have it right, where the Republicans gained seats in Congress in New York, it was in part about redistricting, but it was also Western New York more than Central New York. And this is a more conservative area culturally. And so let me point to 3 things. Crime played very well in New York, and in part because Eric Adams had been talking a lot about crime. He's the new mayor of New York City. In part because there's a bit of a prison crisis in New York State, especially in New York City. I just have to add that Kathy Hochul, who's the new governor, right after Andrew Cuomo had to resign, and it does appear that there was a gender drag on Hochul's ability to retain her office. She won her election, and she won it quite decisively, but it may have dampened some of the enthusiasm for Democrats, the fact that she's a woman. And again, I think that that's something we gotta be eyes open about, right? Flossie, a few weeks ago, you said you hope the Democrats next time nominate a woman who's a person of color, right? And I kind of pushed back and said, is it worth doing that if that means Donald Trump is president again? And I do think we have to acknowledge that there are a certain number of people in this society who are just much less willing to vote for a woman or to vote for a person of color than they are for a white man. And that may be a part what happened in Western New York. One more thing here.
And then one more thing for me. Go ahead.
Abortion really wasn't on the ballot in New York. There's no way abortion rights are going away in New York. And so the thing that moved the electorate to the left in places like Michigan, where if the Republicans won, there was really good chance that they would no longer have access to abortion in their state, that wasn't an issue in New York. And so that may have made it such that Democrats didn't have as much of a reason to turn out in New York as they did in some other states. Go ahead, Flossie.
What about Cuomo, when he became the subject of some scandalous incidents? Might that have made a difference in the way the Democrats voted?
Well, sure. And I think more deeply still, the sense that New York State politics are and have always been and continue to this day to be deeply corrupt. So it's hard to get very enthusiastic about them. That
Okay.
drags down what I think is one of the big factors in the national picture, which is that younger people came out to vote. And when they came out to vote, they voted in a more progressive way. So all that to say, yeah, I think that the Cuomo thing maybe indirectly, meant that
Thank you. I said it was trivia.
yeah,
Okay.
no. But it's not trivia. I mean, when state politics are corrupt, people who are more idealistic tend to close down politically. And I think that's
And
especially
don't you think that California politics stinks too?
yeah, no, I haven't really talked with you
Well,
about I believe it's Initiative 30, right? Which would have created or funded this electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I'm still trying to figure out why Newsom opposed that and why it failed, because it seems to me it would have been a really good thing, even if it benefited Lyft. So it benefited Lyft. It also benefits the climate. Which of those things should we care more about? Renee, go ahead.
I think Newsom opposed it because it took away his legislative power.
Okay. So not because it was a handout to Lyft, which is what I heard.
No.
No. Okay. Uh, and I guess I don't know the details there, and whether or not that's a reason not to vote for it or not. It just seems to me that ultimately what it was trying to do was a very good thing to do. Which I don't know if I drive an electric vehicle, and it is one of those things you worry about. You don't want to be in the middle of nowhere where there's no charging station, and that handicaps people in their willingness to convert to electric vehicles.
I
Go ahead,
think
Renee.
there was a bit of concern also that it would turn off some people from California taxes and leaving the state.
Barbara, go ahead.
I'm going to turn my screen over to David Pearson.
Okay, hey David.
Sitting next to Barbara. In looking at the growth of India and China in particular in the last 20 years or so, in terms of the overall distribution of, is it wealth that
GDP.
GDP. I was wondering about growth in terms of traditional materials industry, steel and other material products versus technology. And I was wondering whether there was a difference between China's growth, which seems to me as both traditional industrial as well as technology. But I'm wondering about India's. It seems to me that India's might be more in the technology sector. And then it occurred to me that with the rise of GDP and around the world and technology, might it not be easier for small nations to make rapid advances in that kind of GDP as opposed to the old industrial type GDP?
Just a simple, easy question, right, David? At the end of class. I'll take a stab at a little bit of this, and so first of all, China has a economic policy of transitioning out of what's sometimes called low value added labor, right? So anyone can screw a widget onto a wheel, right? Or a nut or a bolt onto a wheel. And you don't need an educated or disciplined or technically capable workforce to do that. And so the work tends to be the lowest compensated labor. And so China is trying deliberately to move out of that. India definitely does have a vibrant tech sector, but I think it's highly geographically concentrated. And I really don't have the information to hand. My sense, but I'm not positive, I could try to do the research on this, is that it's still a relatively small sector of the Indian economy relative to the overall economy. China, and again, I don't have the exact figures relative to hand, but I believe that Chinese intellectual property theft is valued at over $100 billion a year, right?
Wow.
And so, right, some of that is just making illicit copies of our movies or DVDs, but a fair bit of that is reverse engineering our phones and our computers so that they can make their own versions that will be probably not quite as good, but maybe compete with the Apple or the Samsung version, right? And so all that to say, I think maybe China is more advanced than India in this regard, if my intuitive sense is right. And that part of the reason that China is more advanced, and part of the reason that this is a hard strategy for small, poor countries to pursue, is you have to, on the one hand, have the well-educated workforce and the disciplined workforce. There's a story I like, and I'll be very quick about it. You may have seen Apple was really struggling with its production in China because of the zero COVID policy and the closing of factories. And I want to say it's around 2010 that Barack Obama invited Steve Jobs to the White House because Apple was relocating almost all of its production of its iPhones to China. And Obama directly asked Jobs what he could do to get China to bring the phone production back to Apple to bring the phone production back to the United States. And Jobs told this story of having discovered a defect in the screen on one of the iPhones and having called the manufacturer, the factory, and saying, we need to pull all the screens out of the iPhones that you've already made and put new screens on. And that the workers were sleeping in dorms at the factory, and that they woke them up in 4 a.m. to go back to work, and that the workers complied, and that the result was that the iPhones got to the Apple stores on the date promised, despite the problem with the screens that would have pushed production back by months had they not had this workforce that they could get to work in the middle of the night on 5 minutes notice, right? And so you got to have a workforce like that. You have to have the technology, and you have to have the ability either to generate your own intellectual property or be big enough that you can steal it, and basically nobody can do anything about it. So I don't know. Maybe that is India as well as China, but it's not many other countries in the world. And so the Chinese model may not be available, at least the model of economic growth, to other countries as they transition from being an industrial, low value added into being a more post-industrial, high value added labor society or economy. Thank you for the good question, David. It's obviously pretty complicated. I'm just scratching the surface in the limited time we have. All right, everyone. Good as always being with you. Take care of yourselves. And happy holidays. I hope you enjoy your Thanksgivings, and I look forward to seeing you a few days after that. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always.